The DSM is a Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. It's been around since 1958.
So we first tried, actually, about 10 years ago to get parental alienation entered as a mental disorder. And we were told way back then that they didn't want to consider it a mental disorder, but they did consider it a relational problem. And those are terms that are used in the DSM. A mental disorder is like schizophrenia is a mental disorder. And those are mental phenomenon that are in the patient. That's the term that they use. And they said that parental alienation is not inside the child, it's between the child and another person. So that's what they would call a relational problem. It's a mental condition. So they told us that 10 years ago.
Professor Bernet with Dr. Wambold and Dr. Narrows, Wambold and Narrows wrote the section in the DSM about children affected by parental relationship distress, and they published in the premier journal for psychiatrists and child psychiatrists, no, we were talking about parental alienation, and the effects of domestic violence and the effects of parental alienation when we wrote this section in the DSM about children affected by parental relationship distress.
And so last year, we submitted another proposal suggesting that parental alienation be considered a mental condition, which is what they want to call it. They've been considering that proposal, and they got back to us, and they're not quite ready for it to be a separate number, a separate entity, a separate relational problem. They're suggesting that it should be an example of a relational problem that is already in the DSM. So there is one that's been in the DSM for many years called parent-child relational problem. And that's when there's conflict between a child and a parent or some difficulty in the relationship that goes on for a period of time.
What can be going on cognitively, affectively, or behaviorally with a child or another family member? And in there is the term unwarranted feelings of estrangement. And then unwarranted feelings of estrangement is synonymous with parental alienation. Because that's what happens when a child is alienated. They develop unwarranted or unjustified feelings of estrangement.
People who make these decisions with the American Psychiatric Association seem to agree that that's how parental alienation should be considered. It should simply be an example of parent-child relational problem. But they have not yet approved it. But to tell the truth, that would be a very simple change in the DSM, in that chapter of the DSM. This is a chapter called Other Conditions that may be of clinical interest. So it would be good just to have it mentioned as an example of parent-child relational problem. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be good to do that.
Page 715 talks about parental overprotection, hostility towards, scapegoating. These are things that we know from previous research, historically, alienating parents engage in.
We think that if it were to be even simply mentioned as an example, it would be taught in schools and in graduate schools to psychology graduate students, to psychiatry trainees, to attorneys in law school and judges. It would be recognized and taught. And also, there wouldn't be so many arguments about it. Nowadays, if we go to court, sometimes there's a big argument about whether parental alienation really exists. And if it were mentioned, even just as an example in the DSM, I don't think we would have to argue so much about that. In the ICD, caregiver-child relationship problem is the same thing as in the DSM, it's parental-child relational problem. So the ICD is the International Classification of Diseases, which is published by the World Health Organization. So we also proposed that parental alienation should be in that book. And we went through a similar process in that they didn't want it to be a separate category, a separate diagnosis. But we ran into some trouble. What they did do is they put it in the index of the book, and it was there for about a year, and then they took it out of the index. They took parental alienation and a parental estrangement out of the index. And there are groups of people who wrote in and complained about it. I think there was pressure by people who don't like this concept. So they did do an interesting thing. They did write on the ICD website that if somebody has a family or a child that has parental alienation, that they can use the term. And so it is interesting that the ICD people wrote it's on their website, that if a person wants to make the diagnosis of parental alienation, they can use that term. So they're actually saying in their language that parental alienation is an example of caregiver-child relationship problem. Although it doesn't say that in the actual text, it says that in an additional memo that they put out. So we're actually proposing the same thing, that if we do the same thing with the DSM, it's basically the same concept, that parental alienation is an example of this broader diagnosis that's already in the book.